was the American scene in the summer of 1831. Little fields of waving grain, arduously planted, cultivated by back-breaking toil, and the harvest gathered with crude implements which had been little improved upon for centuries. Until recent generations, farmers were using the same reaping hooks and sickles that were employed by the ancient Egyptians. With a sickle, a man could cut only half an acre of grain in a long, hard day. Truly, mankind was shackled to the soil, engaged in an endless struggle for bread. Centuries after the sickle came the scythe. Now using both hands, one could still cut only 2.5 acres a day. Out of the scythe came the cradle, with long fingers to lay the grain in rows, and binding became easier. These three hand tools, the tools of famine, slavery, and failure, represented the entire progress of harvesting implements until just a little more than 100 years ago. In this peaceful setting, an event took place which was destined to change the entire course of agriculture and banish the primitive drudgery of hand farming. Here, in a valley of the Blue Ridge Mountains, was the old McCormick homestead. And here we shall see an historically faithful reenactment of the building of the world's first successful reaper. On this Virginia farm stood the old McCormick blacksmith shop, which became the birthplace of that instrument of freedom, the reaper. It was only a rude farm smithy where Cyrus McCormick, at 22, worked on his invention. But he was impelled by the same driving power which has ever caused men with vision to plod on, until that which is only an idea takes physical shape. Others had tried to solve the problem of a mechanical reaper, for which there was desperate need. Over all the world, new lands were being opened to agriculture. The development of America was waiting for some better, cheaper way to harvest grain. And the tools of old were like so many ancient fetters on the limbs of men. Young McCormick, as a boy of 15, had already made an improved cradle by which he was able to keep up with able-bodied men in the field. Later, he invented a plow which threw alternate furrows on either side. It was his vision of a new day on the farm which fired him to accomplish what had long been only a cherished dream in the minds of many men. A source of the young man's inspiration was his father, Robert McCormick, who had attempted to design a mechanical reaper as far back as 1816, and again in the year 1831. The elder McCormick had devised other machines for mill and farm, but the key to the riddle of the reaper was not to be his. Some of the friends and neighbors in the community were highly sympathetic and encouraging to young Cyrus. Such was Colonel James McDowell, full of faith in the boy's ability and perseverance. To others, such as Captain William Massey, the problem seemed impossible of solution. Doubt and skepticism characterized the manner and words of the captain. He typified the people of the day, believing it a waste of time and energy to try to create a mechanical reaper that would work. It was the firm conviction of such men that one must always see the toilers with their scythes and cradles in the fields. Undaunted by such cynicism and encouraged by the faith of his friends, McCormick persevered. With his only helper, the faithful servant, Joe Anderson, he fitted each piece bit by bit as gradually a basic part took shape. The knife blade on which he worked was to be propelled forward through the grain, cutting it with a side-to-side motion. Out of this sliding of the cutting bar evolved a principle which has since been embodied in all successful harvesting machines. One interested observer was William, younger brother of the inventor. He visited the shop and field many times while the frame took shape around a great wooden bull wheel. This main wheel was designed to carry the weight of the machine and to impart motion to both the reel and cutting blade as the machine was hauled along the ground. Captain Massey had called it a contraption. No doubt it was a strange creation to one who could not visualize how all these parts would work. Other interested spectators were the two younger brothers, Leander and John. The workshop was to them just another spot in their rounds of play over the serene and comfortable home farm. It was with only the usual fascination of young boys for mechanical oddities that they watched the work progress. But there was one who had unbounded faith in Cyrus, Mary Ann Hall McCormick, his mother. Full of solicitude lest he exhaust himself, she was proud of her son's desire to finish his work in time for the present harvest. For in that day of tedious toil, many days were required to cut the grain, and as always, it must be gathered at just the right time. It was the farmer's greatest dread that once the grain was right for cutting, the weather wouldn't hold fair until he got it in. With this in mind, McCormick kept at the job constantly, hardly stopping for meals. While the elder McCormick had abandoned his own effort to build a practical reaper, he was intensely interested in the progress of the work under the hands of his son. Cyrus McCormick began at the point where other inventors had failed. Others who had tried to devise a reaper had relied on knives, which worked like a scythe, or on a rotary cutter, or on one which worked like vibrating shears. But McCormick's sliding cutting bar was to prove the sound and lasting device which has prevailed in all of the reapers with which we are familiar today. But the knife alone was not enough to reap the grain which stood in prime condition. It was necessary to find a means of cutting that which had fallen and become a tangled mass. A reel would be needed, large enough to reach forward and pick up the low-lying stalks and carry them toward the blade. And so, part by part, under the inspiration of his sympathetic parents, the young inventor strove toward his goal. It was now approaching the end of summer. The short harvesting period always rushed by so fast that tons of grain often lay rotting in the fields under the hoofs of cattle. Cyrus could not wait for another season to go by. This workshop was a far cry from the modern laboratories and machine shops of today, where scientists, chemists, draftsmen, and mechanical engineers turn out the modern inventions of which our grandfathers dreamed. The materials of Cyrus McCormick's time were only the native hardwoods of the Virginia hills, and the pieces of iron, which had to be patterned and shaped by hand at the forge, were the crudest of local metals. The metallurgical knowledge we have today and the devices for cutting gears and casting metal parts were unheard of in 1831. Here was a young man who had never seen a railroad, had never been to college, using only such knowledge as he had gained on the farm and materials found at hand. In that early day, all the great basic inventions had great obstacles to overcome. The cotton gin of Eli Whitney, the steamboat of Robert Fulton, the sewing machine of Elias Howe, and on down the line of machines which did so much to change our lives and times, so much to add to the ease of living in the past 100 years. Day by day, the reaper grew from an idea into a machine. The fingers at the edge of the cutting blade solved one problem, that of supporting the grain while it was being cut. McCormick developed another important feature, which he called the outside divider, a curved arm to separate the grain to be cut from that which was left standing. With so many innovations, it was small wonder that the doubting ones were convinced that young McCormick was wasting his time. How could these various parts function all together? Wasn't it too much to believe that the main wheel, moving along the ground much like the tread of our modern tractors, could motivate these crudely shaped parts and make them work? Captain Massey thought so, but the determined inventor felt safe in declaring that within a few days' time, before this harvest was over, they would see this machine really cutting grain. At last, the day for the public test arrived. Cyrus's own mother and father, the boys and his sisters, Amanda, Joanna, and Mary Caroline, had already gone to the appointed place. Colonel McDowell's family, loyal and hopeful, were among the first to start for the field. We can easily believe that Captain Massey was not the only one who traveled to the neighboring field, convinced that a failure would be witnessed, and one more man mocked with derision as a crazy inventor. Naturally, the projected experiment had been noised about the countryside. Farmers, villagers, and their families trudged for miles to take in the show. This was going to be just about as good as a circus. And of the farmers and field hands, probably more were prepared to have a good laugh that day than to applaud at the test of neighbor McCormick's newfangled grain cutter. Such as it was, the reaper was ready for its test. Last-minute preparations at the old blacksmith shop found Joe as he hitched up excited over the prospect, much more so than the inventor himself, who had gone to dress up for the occasion. But for every neighbor who found time to visit the field, several others felt they dared not leave the harvesting. The loss of any precious hour when the crop was ripe to be cut, with the danger of the grain becoming too ripe and breaking down, might be disastrous. Of course, the inventor would take a last-minute look at his creation to see that every part was ready for the first public appearance. The drive wheel, the reel, the cutting bar, all were in place. And Joe's important duty was to be the raker, drawing the grain from the platform which had been designed to catch it. Farmers whose backs were bent and whose fingers were scarred from the harvest labor glanced with contemptuous curiosity at the queer rig which was expected to cut grain without the use of hands. The barnyard doubting Thomases were not cradles just yet a while. No siree. It was only a rough Virginia road, but it proved to be young McCormick's road of destiny, his pathway to service for all humanity. The historic spot where the first public exhibition of the cutting of grain by a mechanical reaper took place was close by the old McCormick homestead. It was in a field of late grain owned by John Steele at the nearby hamlet of Steele's Tavern, where the fateful exhibition had been arranged. As family, friends, and neighbors gathered, waiting for McCormick and his reaper to appear, an air of curious expectancy was in the crowd. The confident ones and the doubters were on hand. Which would be right when the machine was put to the test in the waving grain? At last, young Cyrus and his lumbering reaper entered the field and moved down toward the place where the grain was standing. Part of John Steele's field had already been cut by hand. Now they would see whether McCormick's invention could do as well. The little group around the machine was eager to get a good look at the contrivance. Here, indeed, was a strange monstrosity. A pilot, hopefully plodding westward with his few goods, his axe, and his scythe, looked curiously at a scene which seemed to concern him little. He could not know, but transportation itself, as we know it today, waited there too to be swept on by the reaper. The onlookers wondered, why doesn't it go? Will it go? They would believe it when they really saw it work. Miracles. Young McCormick's invention was actually reaping grain. To the amazement of all, that contraption which had amused the countryside was literally marching down the field, cutting grain just as clean as a whistle. The crowd saw with its own eyes a clean line being marked off by the divider, the reel pressing the grain down toward the blade, saw the stationary fingers hold the stalks firmly against the knife, the platform catching grain 6 times faster than grain ever fell before. They saw the ponderous creation jolting down John Steele's field on its big main wheel, and the stout gears which Cyrus had hewn with his own hands, impelling motion to all these fantastic parts. It was clumsy as an ox cart, but it reaped. It proved that the basic ideas which the young man had worked out were sound. Here was a scene to make historians wonder why most men had been content with the same farm tools which had been used for centuries, while the world was crying for bread. Here was a nation which had been established for more than 50 years, but so far no grain had ever been cut by machine. And today, we can realize the magnitude of the event when we consider that if we reaped our grain as the Romans did with sickle and scythe, it would require half the population to produce our bread, not to mention the rest of the food we eat. Here, indeed, was an eventful day. The world's first successful reaper. History had been made that day on a little Virginia farm. Cyrus McCormick's machine had cut as much as 6 men would have cut by the best methods in use before that time. The hopes and dreams of a father had come true through the genius, the will, and determination of his son. Your reaper is a success, Robert McCormick told him, and I am proud to have a son do what I could not do. Doubt and cynicism gave way to conviction. Even Massey was among the first to offer congratulations. And so the pioneer moved westward, followed by wave on wave of immigration. But none dreamed that their sons would see this machine, and others descended from it, the means of building up an agricultural empire in a West much beyond the horizon of their imagination. Crude it was, that first model of the harvesting machine of 1831. Nearly 10 years would have passed before McCormick was ready to make his first sale. To have invented it was not enough. There was still required that same tenacity to keep improving and demonstrating it, and to introduce it to a still somewhat dubious world. Through the years, the development continued, and by 1851, an improved cutting mechanism was added, and another feature, a seat for the raker. It was in this year that McCormick's reaper took first prize at the London exhibition. In 1847, McCormick had established his own factory in Chicago, thus starting the world's greatest harvesting machine works. In 1855, the reaper won the gold medal at the Paris Exposition. This was another step in the progress of the harvest, the self-raking reaper, the first truly one-man machine. In 1858 came the marsh harvester, cutting 10 acres a day. 2 men riding on the machine tied the grain by hand. This was the forerunner of the self-binding machines, because an elevated platform was arranged so that the grain could be delivered in the right position and in good condition to be bound. The first self-binder appeared in the 70s, a simple mechanism which consisted of 2 steel fingers that moved back and forth and twisted a wire band around each sheaf of grain. It increased the cut to as much as 14 acres a day, but the farmers were afraid that the wire would injure the cattle and get tangled in the grain. Something better was still to be found. The needed improvement was the first twine binder, an amazing thing for the period of the early 80s. Steel arms flashed a cord around a bundle of grain, tied a knot, cut the cord, and flung off the sheave. With this machine, 1 man could cut and bind the grain from 20 acres in 1 day. The reaper had long since been the wonder of people in foreign countries. During the Civil War, it was astonishing that the United States could support 2 armies and still sell enough grain to feed 35 million people. Now, with the development of power farming, came the tractor binder. The tractor not only drawing the binder, but also furnishing, through the power takeoff, direct driving power to operate the machine and binding mechanism. Now it was harvesting 35 acres a day, almost twice as much as any horse-drawn binder. A long step forward from the old wooden main wheel of 1831. Latest and greatest of all harvesting machines is the harvester thresher or combine, great-grandchild of McCormick's first reaper. With its power, capacity, and all the refinements of those early basic principles, this giant of farm machines is far beyond the imagination of the people who watched that first simple reaper. Marching swiftly across the fields, the combine cuts and threshes and cleans in one operation from 18 to 50 acres in a single day. Beneath the clamor of the modern harvest is still the soft whir of that first reaper heard round the world. And great modern trucks gather the finished grain, another long step from the crude wooden platform where the yet unthreshed stalks fell from the blade of that early harvester. From cradle to combine, from drudgery to mass production on the farms, from worldwide want to worldwide plenty. Such is the romantic history which began with Cyrus McCormick's invention in 1831. The Romance of the Reaper.